Thank you for letting me share our experience, and good morning to everyone. Um, in the time that we have, I thought it was important that we talk a little bit about um, our experience, because in some of the calls that I've been on with PCE and in other groups, I think that we're all across the country experiencing much of the same growing pains as we closed our offices and continued to try to work on our mission of public safety and care for the safety of our people at the same time. So our experience with the materials that you have will give you a sense of what we have done and how we've tried to respond to the pandemic and continue to work. I can't stress enough how important it is to prepare your staff, both attorneys and your support staff, for reopening. I think it's a very important step for us. We worked very hard to create a set of guidelines or a governing document of which you have there. And as we started to look at what we were going to try to do, the first notion that came to my mind is that I'm not an expert in public health. I'm not even close to being an expert in public health, but we can certainly find people who are. And I was able to speak to some of our local healthcare professionals through the county health department. We have a University of Florida teaching hospital close by. And so I was able to get advice and guidance, which I thought was very important for us as we prepared a document to talk about what our strategy was for reopening, so that our people had a sense that we knew what we were doing, and we had backstopped much of our guidance with medical professionals. In the documents that we prepared, they're by no means all-inclusive. We tried very hard to keep our information focused and directed. Communication throughout this entire process has been a challenge. The early advice was you need to over-communicate. And at some point, I think as you over-communicate, you kind of drowned out your message, especially with our staff. So we tried to make sure that as we updated, we could still go back to a governing document and say these governing principles control. If you're sick, stay home. If we're going to be in the building, you need to socially distance and wear a mask, which became somewhat of a political issue and a very difficult issue for us as we try to follow the CDC guidance, we try to follow the state guidance, we try to follow our local guidance. So there's a lot of mixed messaging, and we wanted to make sure that we at least had a governing document everybody could go back to. The other important point, aside from the public health issues, has been just some of the employment law issues that are related to the Families First Coronavirus Act with the paid medical leave. We're not employment lawyers, and I by no means would be an expert in that. So we went and found as much as we could online from the Department of Labor, trying to explain what some of these current rules are. And we were also very mindful of the continuing issues that we have with medical confidentiality, with age discrimination, as we started to figure out, well, who are our vulnerable employees? You just can't roll in and say, well, this person's 65, they need to stay home. So these are issues that I would ask you and tell you that it'd be really good for you to seek some type of outside counsel, whether it's a friend of the office or someone that you've worked with in the past. And many people I have found have been very helpful and willing to help. The structure that we set up with our floor captains was a sense in my mind that if we're all responsible for each other's safety, then it's important that we have a shared responsibility and we incorporate everyone into this process. And it's worked out very well for us. What I tried to do and what I think we've been able to successfully achieve is empowering staff and attorneys who are supervisors, or designating people to work with the supervisors in each one of the areas of the office, so that we can have a voice that allows two-way communication. The employees can speak to the floor captains and convey their concerns to us, and then we can also try to direct messaging and direct guidance down through the floor captains. And they've been very helpful with us, because as we began to reopen, we started this process in early June. We went through 2 weeks of a 25% occupancy. The floor captains had created schedules based on their staff on their individual floor in the building so that we would have no more than 25% of our staff in the building. And then secondly, and more importantly, is we tried to make sure that as we brought people back, we brought them back in segregated groups so that in the event that someone was exposed or someone tested positive, we'd be able to quickly isolate and determine who that individual had exposure to so that you don't find yourself going across different floors, going across different work groups and not being able to have a sense of where the exposure and who needs to self-isolate may be. The other important part is just as much as you prepare your people, you really need to prepare your building. I thought it was important that as our people returned to our office, that they noticed that it was different, that just the physical layout was different. So I spent a day walking through, looking at doors, what could we open, how could we reduce touch points. We've got floor placards like most people would have, reminding people to socially distance. We limited occupancy in elevators to 2 people. And then we just began the process of trying to procure as many supplies as we could for hand sanitizer, masks. We were able to find plexiglass to put up at some of our public entrances so that the messaging is that we are able to let our employees know and see for themselves that the office looks different and it feels different when they're here. The contract tracing became very important for us because, as I said, we reopened on June 1st and we went to phase 2, which was 50% occupancy in the middle of June. And we had no sooner gotten through a week of our phase 2 occupancy before the numbers really started to take off in Florida, and we actually had our first positive employee COVID test. And so this allowed us to look quickly into what we had, and just in that experience of contact tracing, something as simple as one person, we found ourselves talking to as many as 8 to 10 people as a result of that one incident. So the important part for us was that as we got up to 50%, we decided to go back to phase 1. And the benefit of the floor captain model and the scheduling model is that we already had that in place. So as you reopen, if you have a strategy for going from phase 1 to phase 2, you can also go back to phase 1 rather quickly if you need to, which is where we are in our current state. The other important part that we've tried to focus on very carefully has been working with our court system. And depending upon where you are and what your jurisdiction is in terms of the community spread, you're probably operating through virtual court systems, Zoom, that's our current state. We have a local working group that our chief judge put together, and I would encourage you to make sure that you have a seat on that working group, because you do need to have a voice as to things related to what's a jury trial going to look like, how are we going to work through those steps, what will voir dire look like. Florida has a civil model that they have started where they're actually starting a civil trial in South Florida, and I believe we have one as a study in Jacksonville in a few weeks that's going to give us a lot of information about what we might be able to do in the criminal context. The other important thing is in determining what your backlog is, because clearly you have one. We looked at what our felony and misdemeanor case counts were doing as we shut down in March, and we're trying to work through the time frame of when we might get to reopen, and we've noticed that our felony cases and misdemeanor cases both went up in number.
Reminder, 5 minutes.
There's an effect as it relates to how you work with not only your court system, but your clerk's office as well. What kind of backlog does your clerk have with notices to appear or summons cases that haven't been calendared? Especially when you're not able to have members of the community from outside coming back to the courtroom to resolve their cases. We've worked very closely trying to manage what that caseload looks like, and also try to identify what our trial cases are going to be when we do get to a point where we have jury trials returning. Have we determined what our speedy trial backlog looks like? Right now, speedy trial is told but eventually that tolling will disappear. And the question is, well, what are the first 2 cases? What are the first 10 cases going to be that are going to need to be tried? We also are very importantly working with our local law enforcement officers as it relates to our jail population. We undertook a very stringent review of who was in jail, why they were in jail, what their bond might be. And we operated for a very long time, probably 90 days before we had a case in the jail. And about 3 weeks ago, a case developed. And what became 50 cases went to 100 cases, went to 200 cases. So for the last 4 weeks, we've essentially been operating without the ability to move inmates through the jail. How are our police working in the community? Because we have a violent crime problem. You can see across the country that there are violent crime issues. We still have to continue our mission of public safety, but we've also got to be mindful that there are people in the jail right now that maybe are there that don't need to be there because of bond issues and an inability to afford that. We undertook an expedited review where we paired a senior attorney with a junior attorney, and over about a 4-month period, 3-month period, we were able to look at over 9,000 cases and try to make determinations about bail and bond and just provability. As a final review, one of the things that I think is really important is the time frame. When we began to close down, I think most people thought this would be over in 2 weeks. It might be over in 4 weeks. We're now several months into this. So then the question is, this is probably the way we're going to operate. When we reopened, I believe that there wasn't a sense in the office or even in our community that we were going to experience what we're experiencing today. In Jacksonville, the conditions in the community are worse than they were in the middle of March. We thought for many instances we had dodged this. The numbers were low in Florida and they are not low anymore. So that means that we're going to continue to work this way. When we had talked to our public health officials, remote working became the order of the day, and many of them were telling us you're going to need to continue a remote working protocol until there are therapeutics or until there's a vaccine. Our employees have taken to remote working and have found in the community survey, I want you to take a moment when you can to look at some of the responses because I think they're universal. Our employees felt like they were productive working remotely. They want to continue to work remotely. And many of them do have some reservations about returning to business as usual before the pandemic. So I think remote working is here to stay in some fashion. We're just kind of catching up with the private sector. This has already been a trend in the private sector that had been really an employment opportunity for them to offer to people to come to work for them. And I think it's going to continue with us. Remote court proceedings, status conferences, something as simple as juror qualification. In the civil case that I mentioned, they did juror qualification through Zoom, and they found that that was relatively effective. Jurors logged in, they expressed their concerns about why they couldn't come in or didn't want to come in, and they were able to eliminate bringing anywhere from 600 to 1,000 people to a courthouse to ask them whether or not they were capable or continued to qualify.
Reminder, 1 minute.
All of these steps that we have gone through, resilience or resiliency is what keeps coming to mind. Is your office able to open back up, move to a second phase, and then quickly return to a first phase if the circumstances around you are changing? And I think it's important to keep mindful of that. It's also important to continue to review the guidance, because guidance from the CDC, guidance from your public health officials will change. Some of the issues related to the spread have changed about whether it's in the air, whether it's aerosolized, to touching surfaces. So we were focused heavily on Lysol wipes, and I don't think in 3 months that we've been able to get any. So we've tried very hard to eliminate touch bases, but now our turn, we're looking at things like our HVAC in the building. What kind of filters do we have? So these are all painful lessons that we've learned the hard way. Necessity has required us to really adapt And I think it's going to continue to allow us to continue our mission, and we'll need to adapt next month and the month after and the month beyond. So thank you for your attention and letting me share our experience in Jacksonville with you.